formally bring in Nate Regola from Regola Cyber. He's going to talk about, how and why he chose PreVeil to be his partner for becoming an authorized C3PAO. And so, Nate, welcome.
Thank you. And obviously, I've been tracking PreVeil for a while, and we ended up signing a license agreement on March 23rd, 2024, and we did the setup, which was very short, on April 5th, and then we went for assessment via DIBCAC on May 20th to the 24th. Obviously, we received a 110 without a poem window, which we were very excited about, and the takeaway obviously is, which we were expecting, the DIBCAC assessors were very professional and rigorous. And as you obviously highlighted, the security protection assets and security protection data, we found that those were assessed rigorously in our assessment.
And Nate, just for the folks on the call that maybe aren't as clear, what you meant when you said the assessment was awarded without a poem window, that really means you passed your assessment on the first try. You didn't have any findings that you had to go and correct during that 180 window, which is really rare. And congrats to you and your team that you essentially got your assessment passed on the first try.
Yes, thank you. Next slide, please. And why we chose PreVeil. Obviously, the zero trust architecture is really powerful, and we like that a lot. I think few settings in the PreVeil SaaS obviously means less compliance risk and a lower level of effort, right? I mean, if you had to configure 500 settings, that would take a ton of time, but PreVeil is much simpler, which I think is awesome. And it's clearly designed for external sharing with customers, which, in today's world, right, that's huge. You don't want something that's clunky. And obviously, there is training through PreVeil University available for end users with minimal level of effort for administrators. So certainly that could be very helpful to a lot of organizations. Next slide, please. And so, how we were able to go from, kind of contract signing to assessment in such a short time, it's really a couple of reasons. And one of those is we had a reference architecture that covered the endpoints and the network and so forth. And so we were able to quickly deploy that and then layer the PreVeil on top of that. So obviously we licensed the PreVeil, software and compliance documentation bundle to get access to the CRM and the FedRAMP moderate equivalent body of evidence. We use zero trust principles throughout our reference architecture. We have a next-gen firewall with VPN. Obviously MFA, we used Windows endpoints in this environment. Our architecture supports iPhone and Android. We did not take that through assessment given the short timeline. We did not add the iPhone into our environment. We have support for physical sites in the reference architecture or cloud only. We have an approximately 275-page system security plan. And we also have an MSP version of that system security plan with a customer responsibility matrix. And we designed this really for C3PAOs and MSPs to deploy and manage on behalf of OSCs, including C3PAOs. I know there are certainly some C3PAO candidates that don't want to manage and maintain their own environments. So certainly an MSP could be beneficial there. We think our architecture is scalable and, it's secure, right? In some cases, we're exceeding the current CMMC requirements, and we aim for zero trust in our architecture as well. So the MSPs that want to do multi-tenant have a strong foundation to do that with. And obviously we aim for competitive pricing. I say, as we kind of proved, it can be deployed within weeks, although we recommend, 10 weeks as a comfortable minimum timeline. If you're trying to review all the documentation, make sure that the policies and procedures are acceptable to you, doing that in a few weeks is obviously we did it, but it made for some long weeks. So we don't recommend repeating that unless you don't want a lot of sleep.
And Nate, just so I'm clear, your reference architecture, I've talked to a lot of C3PAOs and other organizations who are kind of taking the VDI route to lower the complexity of their compliance, even though it adds significant additional costs. Just to be clear, did you deploy this in a VDI, or was this pure, you used actual endpoints?
Yeah, so we used actual endpoints.
Great.
And
Haven't seen too many people pass the assessment in that short a time frame with hardening their own endpoints, so that's very impressive.
Thank you.
So I think at this point, we're ready for some Q&A. If you have any questions, feel free to submit them through the Q&A function. I know several folks did send us questions in advance that we'll be starting with. But again, please feel free to use the Q&A if you have any questions for anything we covered today, or especially any questions for Nate on his journey. So I think we'll just start, again, I think we kind of covered this one. The fact that you were able to, become assessment ready really within less than 2 months, really impressive. The fact this wasn't a VDI, and it seems like, without getting too deep in the weeds, Nate, were there any surprises that when you went through the assessment that DIBCAC kind of threw at you? I know obviously, we had to have the PreVeil federate moderate body of evidence, federate moderate equivalent body of evidence, and that was quite the process. But anything that you any gotchas or maybe any lessons for the audience?
Sure. So, you mentioned the federate moderate body of evidence, and there is, I kind of thought it was a gotcha, right? But they have this special form that you have to fill out and sign and turn into them regarding that body of evidence. And so, as obviously a super small company, those data calls, right, in a large company, you can kind of farm out to a broader team, but it was just the two of us. So I had to deal with that form. And I'm sure as there are more, federate moderate equivalent assessments, they'll become much more familiar with that, and it'll probably get sent to people early in the assessment process. But we did have to deal with that. And then, essentially, your assessment really starts before the actual assessment date, right? Because obviously DIBCAC is reviewing things. And so we could have been, better prepared by capturing some of that evidence. And it kind of goes back to, we're a small company. And so when DIBCAC asked us for, scores of artifacts to send in, those were primarily screenshots that they were looking for. And, we could have certainly anticipated some of that, as an example. If you talk about your background check process, it's probably pretty clear that DIBCAC is going to ask you for evidence that you background checked your people, right? So we could have screenshotted that, those kind of reports from our background check provider, instead of searching through our email from X number of years ago, right, to pull up those records and substantiate when they actually ask for it.
Great. So obviously, you were able to pass in an efficient time frame, so you probably weren't a lot of things that you would change. But was there anything you might have done differently, or anything that might be advice to folks going through this process, just to kind of watch out for, pay attention to make things even a little bit easier?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would absolutely try to collect the evidence that you think is likely based on your SSP, and then DIBCAC does have their sort of assessment database publicly available online, and that can sort of provide some hints too as to what they are going to be looking for. Obviously they're going to be looking at assessment objective level, and so if you say, I have background check provider X doing my background checks, you probably want to capture that evidence and have it ready, assuming that they're either going to ask for it ahead of the assessment or during the assessment. And it took me a lot more time to capture evidence than I thought, right? Because I knew where all the settings were. I knew we had this stuff, but what you're literally talking about, work days upon work day to collect the evidence that in some cases is being requested. And I'm not faulting them for asking for it, right? I mean, obviously the assessment scope there's a lot of objectives, so they have to ask for a lot of evidence.
That's great. And now that you've actually gone through this process and you've had to create all that evidence, it did allow you to kind of create a reference architecture, that you think is, and obviously the DIBCAC community agrees, is a great approach to, achieving compliance, both in a time efficient manner, but also, as you said, built on zero trust security principles. and built at a very high level of overall security, fidelity. You just tell us a little bit more about your reference architecture. Obviously, PreVeil is a core part of that, the PreVeil documentation, but above and beyond that, and if folks have any other questions, how they might, connect with either you or somebody else to talk about that from your team.
Sure, absolutely. I like to think of it because obviously you mentioned that PreVeil is part of the PreVeil solution. So it's the pieces that of the information system that are included with the PreVeil licensing. And to me, that's mainly centering on the endpoint security, right? Network firewall, VPN, MFA, and how those integrate. And obviously we inherit from PreVeil's documentation and the commercial cloud services that we suggest being used. So our architecture is really a full SSP architecture diagrams that are extremely detailed, showing data flows of MFA authentication for different components and so forth, instructions on how to configure and integrate the components so that you have MFA occurring where you need it to, logs are being captured, vulnerability scanning, etc. And for those that have been through assessment, there's obviously a lot to do, and you save time on the non-PreVeil pieces by leveraging the integration work they've already done and not reinventing the wheel for things like MFA. PreVeil is pretty quick to set up, right? But lots of the other components aren't. And you can get started by talking to us to discuss the reference architecture, or obviously talking to PreVeil or PreVeil partner if you already have one, to determine the best PreVeil licensing for your organization. And then we can share the details of the reference architecture for your company's use or for the MSP version if you want to operate it on behalf of customers.